Hello. In this video, I'll be showing how to use SOAtest to send GraphQL queries to APIs that have GraphQL implemented. If you're watching this video, you probably already know a little bit about what GraphQL is. For those of you that don't, you can visit graphql.org to learn more about it. But long story short, GraphQL is a query language for APIs, hence the QL in GraphQL. And it allows users to retrieve only the data that they need. Your typical REST APIs are configured to send back all the data they're configured to send back. But with GraphQL APIs, users are able to filter out unnecessary or unwanted data. Take, for example, this sample GraphQL query. Now, what this is asking for are the first and last names of users. So whatever endpoint this query is being sent off to, that service will be sending back the first and last names of its users. With that said, with the same query, if we took out the last name, then that service will only be sending back the first names of users. Now, let's actually get into how to use SOAtest to send GraphQL queries. You can use the REST and messaging clients to send GraphQL queries. I chose to use the REST client. Here's how I've configured it. So, you'll be sending the GraphQL query to some GraphQL endpoint. And this is how you have to configure the payload. As you've already probably noticed, these queries look very much like JSON. However, they aren't actually in JSON format, which means you can't build or parse them as JSON. So you'll want to encode the GraphQL query as a JSON string and then post it in a simple JSON object containing a string called query. You'll want your form JSON view to look somewhat like this. You just have to copy paste the query into this query string, like so. And if you've configured the payload correctly, you should be able to get a successful response. Let's look at the traffic viewer. And what you'll see in the response are the first and last names of users John Doe and Alicia Smith. Now, going back to what I mentioned earlier, these GraphQL queries can be used to filter out data that you do not want. So let's say you don't want the last name of these users. You can simply delete them from the query, hit save, and then run the client again to see how the response is now being sent back. And as you'll see, since we took out the last name, the API is no longer sending back the last name of the users. And that is basically how you send GraphQL queries using SOAtest. A couple of things to mention before this video ends. If your GraphQL API requires some type of authentication in order for you to access its resources, then you simply have to configure your client, in my case the REST client, to perform authentication. And you can configure this in the HTTP options tab of your client under security. And depending on the type of security your API has, you'll want to configure your client accordingly. And the last thing I'd like to mention is that GraphQL response payloads are returned in JSON format, so you'll be able to use any of the JSON tools in SOAtest to consume the response. For example, if I wanted to enforce the correctness of the data being returned, I can use a JSON asserter attached as an output to the REST client to do so. In my case, if I wanted to make sure that the names of these users will be John and Alicia, then I can simply configure my JSON asserter to do just that. Now, if I want to make sure that the first name of one of the users is John, then I simply have to add an assertion to make sure that we are expecting John to be returned by the service. We can also do this for Alicia. Now if I run this REST client again, I'll see that the test succeeded because the assertions did not fail. Now let's say I'm supposed to expect a name other than John. Now if I run this REST client again, the test should fail because I'm asserting that the incoming response should be Louis, but it's actually coming back as John. And we can see it in the quality task view exactly why the test failed. The actual value that's coming in is John, but we have enforced our test to expect the value of Louis. And that is it for this video about GraphQL. Thank you for listening.